Good morning, everybody. Time for Discord Q&A number 23. Starting out with, about the off-meta buffs. Does the two similar gameplay rule not apply anymore? Talking about AP Ezreal. So, talking about the two similar gameplay rule, if you've ever heard myself or August talk about off-builds, especially when someone comes and pitches us an off-build of like, hey, what about this, AP build for this champion, or this AD build for this champion, or this tank build for this champion? One of the things we'll often say is that for ideal off-builds, we generally want them to be well differentiated and clearly different than the champion's main build, right? As an example of what the sort of gold standard of this looks like is Shaco, right? AD and AP Shaco play very differently. They're even differentiated pretty well by ability, right? Like Q, for example, on AD Shaco is your primary tool, right? It's the way that you get to your targets. It's primarily what you're playing around, like the main thing that you're looking at of like, okay, this is how I get to my targets and try to get behind them and assassinate them, like looking for the one shot. And then for AP Shaco, it's a repositioning / defensive tool, right? It's not a super critical part of your damage pattern, right? Like your W and your R explosion are what are doing a lot of your damage on AP Shaco, right? Whereas AD Shaco doesn't play around the W much at all, right? It's like mostly a clearing tool, maybe an occasional zoning tool, right? And so things don't necessarily have to be as well differentiated as Shaco, like AD versus AP, in order for us to consider them to be like up to the standard here. But this is not the only thing that applies to whether an off build is providing value or not, right? Like there's also, hey, is the off build healthy? Is it on fantasy? Not just is the gameplay different, right? An example of the gameplay isn't super meaningfully different, but it is still on fantasy. I think Kaisa is a good example here, where she has 3 evolves. We need 3 different stats to tie into these evolves, and they kind of need to be related in some ways in order for this to be compelling. And so one of the ways in which we accomplish this is by giving her an AP ratio on her on hit, which does mean that the AP build ends up feeling similar to the AD build in a lot of ways, especially like the AP like on hit build ends up feeling and playing very similarly to the AD builds for Kaisa, because they both end up just kind of attacking people a lot quickly and doing a lot of damage with their auto attacks, regardless of how much damage their spells do. We still end up in a world where, well, it does play really well into the Kaisa Evolve fantasy that there is, differentiation on here's the full AP build that has the W and E evolves, and that build has like worse wave clear because there's no Q evolve and is more of a caster, more leaning into the caster stuff around W. And then there's the AD like Q and E evolve. Hey, your W is not going to be that important, a super important part of your damage. It's mostly just for applying R marks, so that you can ult to people and applying passive marks, but your passive marks aren't huge, core part of your gameplay as much as they are in AP. And then there's sort of like the Voltron, like all evolves build that kind of gets a mix of everything. And we think that it's generally positive that Kaisa has those attributes, even though I think it's absolutely true that the AD versus AP builds on Kaisa are not super well differentiated. They don't have super meaningful splits in how the champion plays. Like a lot of the gameplay is very, very similar, especially when you compare to the standard of someone like a Shaco or like a Kog'Maw, for example, right? Like Kog'Maw is, yeah, when you play AD Kog'Maw, you're really only playing around your W, or like on hit Kog'Maw, I guess I should say, is like, yeah, it's all about your W. That's all you care about. You just try to attack people with your W. The rest of your spells are really not important. And then AP Kog'Maw is, yeah, my E and my R matter a lot, right? Like there's, maybe the Q matters a little, and the W can be useful. And I do think that for what it's worth, we've kind of degraded this a little bit by buffing the AP ratio on the W on hit quite a bit, and that's why we've seen the rise of some of the like middle of the road Kog'Maw builds with like Dusk and Dawn and things like that, where there it's an AP on hit build, and I think that it would actually be good for us to go back a little on that and differentiate them a little more. But in general, this is like is the gameplay between the builds too similar? It's not a hard and fast rule. There are other considerations, like I was talking about earlier. However, for AP Ezreal, obviously this person asked this question a long time ago. This is one of the things that gets me about taking a long time to get through the questions. This person asked this, I think, when the AP Ezreal stuff was on the PBE, but the AP Ezreal stuff turned out to like just literally not function super well, of course, right? It was just not powerful enough to make a real difference. Like the AP Ezreal build is not particularly functional, it seems. But the intent with the AP Ezreal builds, right? The goal of them was that there would be meaningful differentiation because AP Ezreal was supposed to be a lot about the ult, right? This is why a lot of the power of the buffs was concentrated on the R specifically, where the idea was, hey, you're going to look for big Rs. You're going to look for big Rs on waves to get wave clear. You're going to look for big Rs on champions for big spikes of damage. And regular AD Ezreal will be about constantly, low stakes gambling. Do I hit this Q? Do I hit this Q? Do I hit this Q? And part of what makes Ezreal fun is that when you hit the Q, you get to gamble again. You get to fire another Q sooner, right? Because it refunds its own cooldown. And that's sweet, right? And that's part of what makes Ezreal a really great champion. But the idea with AP Ezreal was that loop would tie into a higher stakes moment around the R, where it would more be about, okay, I'm gambling with my Q consistently, mostly to refund my R and like my other cooldowns, right? Especially like W and E would be a much larger percentage of your damage. And that the idea was, oh, there's going to be bigger, spikier moments around, do I hit this R? And the moment-to-moment gameplay of AP Ezreal is a lot less important, where hitting Qs is nice, but mostly because it refunds your R, and that your hitting Qs consistently would be a lot less damage than AD Ezreal. And so then the big moments would be around, do I hit this R or do I miss? And then trying to refund that. Of course, like as I mentioned, the AP Ezreal stuff it just didn't work out, right? Like just wasn't powerful enough. I'm like out of the loop here. I don't know what Live's thoughts are on that, but I suspect that given how far off it was, I suspect that we probably won't be revisiting this anytime soon, but who knows, right? Like maybe that's not true. I'm out of the loop there, so I can't really speak to that. But the goal was there are big spiky moments, and that's what makes AP Ezreal different is he's about burst. Whether that would have worked or not, like whether that would have been well differentiated enough, right? Like, because I think a lot of the thought process here is like, well, once you buy Lichbane, it's hard for the Q not to do some damage, right? Even if it's less than AD, the Q will still do real damage. And so like the gameplay ends up getting washed out a little. I do think for what it's worth, on Ezreal, just the process of getting to multiple items on AP Ezreal is very different from playing AD Ezreal, and that might serve as differentiation enough. Even if the super late game gameplay is kind of similar, the idea of like mid lane Ezreal where you're building AP and you're very weak on one item is a very, very, very different experience from playing AD Ezreal where it's like, well, you're buying things like, your tier, your long swords, your sheens, and you're actually like pretty good like on 1 and 2 item spikes, and you're pretty good while you're building those. Compare that to AP where pretty much all the things that you're buying are like not very good in lane, not very useful, and you're quite weak on 1 and 2 items. You start getting strong at like 3 and 4 items. Just that power curve differential might have been enough. Again, if the AP Ezreal stuff worked, even though, yes, once you get Lichbane, the gameplay starts to become more similar, start to become a little more homogenous. The power curve might have been different enough if AP Ezreal worked. But because AP Ezreal just ended up not really playing out the way that it was supposed to, or at least at the power level that it needed to function, none of that stuff ever really manifested. But that was the intent, right? And whether it would have worked or not is really kind of unclear because it just ended up not being powerful enough. Ultimate Haste doesn't lower the 75 stack requirement for Aesol's R2. Given the Shyvana ult tweak, I'd be interested to see if this could/should be changed. Short answer, this should not be changed. To explain further, the Shyvana ult tweak that's being discussed here is that Ultimate Haste on Shyvana now gives her, I think it's like Fury generation or whatever we're calling it, Rage Fury, whatever she has, Dragon Fury, I don't know, who knows, whatever that resource is called. But it gives her additional Rage generation. And there's a couple reasons why we did this. The main one is that otherwise, this stat literally does not function on Shyvana, and we might want to tie systems to this thing either for Shyvana personally, right? Like this is like Hexblade, for example. What if we want her to buy Hexblade, if we want that to be a legitimate option for her? Well, then it probably would make sense if the stats would actually function for her, right? Like the stats in her stat system should probably work for her, right? Secondarily, we might want to use this systemically, right? In the past, we've had global systems that give ult haste that you can't opt out of, right? Like there was a version of Cloud Dragon in the past, for example, that gave ultimate haste, and we had to add special cases to Shyvana and Udyr because without that, they could get something that would literally be useless to them that they could not opt out of in any way, shape, or form, right? And it wasn't about, oh, your champion doesn't value this particular thing of like, oh, they don't care about their ultimate. It's just this stat literally does not function for them in the way that it's supposed to, right? And I think this is actually a pretty big departure, by the way, for like, comparing percent AD and AP on something like an Infernal Dragon as an example. It's like, well, that's okay. If you don't buy any AD or AP, you don't get any benefit from that. That's fine. Every champion should have some AD and or AP ratios, and at a bare minimum, you have a 100% AD ratio on your auto attack. And so you can gain benefit if you want to go down that path. But this is a case of, hey, this is saying it gives me something related to my ultimate. I have an ultimate, but it literally doesn't work for me on Shyvana, right? And so we want that to actually function for her. And so I think it is worth the rules break, right? There's a cost to the rules break. Basically, the way we're looking at this is the cost of this not working is higher than the cost of the rule that we're breaking in making the stat do something that it doesn't really do, like do something different, do something that is not in the keeping of the rules or in the sort of letter of the rules, or maybe even in the spirit of the rules. In order to make this champion function better. Something else that's worth noting here is systems proofing is actually really, really helpful for alternate modes as well, right? Things like Mayhem or Arena, where they might have augments like, say, Ultimate Awakening, where, hey, this could be really cool for a champion like a Shyvana, but if the ultimate haste doesn't work, it becomes a lot less attractive, and we want those things to be an option for a champion like Shyvana, because this is basically like, hey, you get buffed when you use your ultimate, and your ultimate is like better in some way, or like cools down, or like comes up more frequently in some way. And so it makes sense to say, like, well, sort of the spirit of ultimate haste is that you get to cast your ultimate more, right? And for Shyvana, it literally is non-functional if she doesn't have some special rules, and so I think that makes sense. With Aurelion Sol, it already works. And not only does it work in the letter of the rules, it also works in the spirit, right? Because Aurelion Sol's R1 actually generates the stacks that you need to get to R2. And so it already functions in both the letter and the spirit. And so the cost of adding a rule break for Aurelion Sol is clearly not worth it over maintaining the rules while saying, hey, the letter and the spirit of the rule are both being followed here already. Why would we add a rules break that has a cost? Like, every rules break has some cost to it. It's just, is the cost worth it or not, is what we're always asking, right? And then the classic example I use a lot of the time of, like, hey, we want Brand and Lilia's spell, damage over time to apply spell effects because we want them to be good with those items. Conversely, we don't want Twitch to be good with those items, and we don't want those. It's like, okay, well, the gameplay that we're getting is clearly worth the cost of there not being a consistent rule in this case, right? In this case, there is a very clear consistent rule, and there is a higher cost to breaking that. And in Aurelion Sol, the cost of violating that is clearly not worth it, right? Over the case of Shyvana, where there's a much higher cost we're paying to make this, like, to keep the rule consistent, because it is violating the spirit of, well, Ultimate Haste says you just get to cast your ultimate more frequently. With Aurelion Sol, that works on both sides of, you get to cast your R1 and your R2 more frequently when you buy Ult Haste. If you go Malignance, you will cast more R2s on average. You will also cast more R1s on average, right? You might not literally cast another R2 in a given game, but you will on average over the course of a large sample of games. And so, like, to me, this is all working as intended, working the way that it should. And I do not believe that it makes sense to do a rules break in Aurelion Sol's case, given that there are costs associated with that. Why is Tahm Kench the singular champion that has size scaling on an ability? So this isn't actually true, by the way. There are other spells in the game that have size scaling. It's usually just more subtle, or not something that's super obvious. Like Cho'Gath, E, and R, for example, both have size scaling. Anyway, why does Tahm Kench have size scaling on his Q? I don't know if this is true. I will tell you the story as I understand it. But I've never actually looked into it. I don't know if this is actually how things work under the hood, because I've never actually looked into the spell. But my understanding, from what I've been told, is that when we were doing the Tahm Kench midscope back in the day, I don't know, what was that, like, when was that, like 2020? I don't know, it was a while ago. Who knows when that was? Could be any time. When we were doing the Tahm Kench midscope, my understanding is that because Tahm Kench Q missile is attached to his model, it is set up in a very different way from basically every single other missile in the game. And because of that, it scales the size of the missile, like visually, with the size of Tahm Kench's model. Now, keep in mind, when we did this, right, the Tahm Kench midscope predates most of the size scaling in the game, right? This is before Heartsteel existed. This is from before tank engine, like, long before Mayhem, right? Like long before most of the things that exist in the game today that increase your size. And so I would guess when he was doing this, Captain Gameplay probably was saying like, this doesn't really matter. And his perspective was like, well, the thing is visually getting bigger. The gameplay should match that. And that won't be a big deal because most of the time when this happens, it'll be like a Lulu ult or something. It'll be very brief. And the visual will better match, like the gameplay and the visual will better match because of this change. Now, of course, over the years, we've added a lot of size scaling to the game, right? I think Heartsteel is the obvious example, but of course, in alternate modes like Arena and Mayhem, there's things like Tank Engine, there's things like Goliath, and so on that increase your size even further. And so that's a case where this ends up being like actually like very gameplay relevant in a way that I think was not originally intended, right? I don't think this was made with the idea of like, yeah, this is going to be really gameplay relevant in ARAM Mayhem, right? Because obviously ARAM Mayhem did not exist at that time, and so on, right? Like that not even necessarily that would be gameplay relevant in SR almost ever because Heartsteel did not exist when this was being done, right? And so I think it's probably worth asking the question, like, would we do this today if we were working on Tahm Kench? I don't know, right? Like we'd probably want to have we'd probably have a deeper interrogation of what it means for a spell to scale with size, and whether we have the correct amount of size scaling in the game. For what it's worth, I think that I probably overtuned Heartsteel when I like made this version of it. Like I'm the person who did the size scaling per 1,000 health that it has now, and I think I probably went a little bit over. Like it probably gives a little bit too much size in the average case. Would is my inclination. So that's something we'd maybe reconsider if we were doing this. But in general, the reason why most spells don't scale with size is that's like, well, that's just not how our spells work by default, right? Like we don't make our visual effects like scale with size by default because it's simpler and more straightforward to just make a spell and know what size it is, right? It is a special process for us to make an effect that is intended to scale different sizes, right? As an example, when I made Malignance back in 2023, I was very explicit. Like when we were making the visual effects, I was like, this particle must be scalable, right? Like it has to be something that looks good at both small and large sizes. Like from a physical perspective, we can change the size of visual effects, but a lot of them aren't tested and don't look good at significantly smaller or larger sizes, or they don't communicate their gameplay very well. And so the Tahm Kench Q1 is more about making the thing making the visual match the gameplay as close as possible, and was not really about the gameplay when it was being done, or not about tying into our systems when it was done, and that's something that came later. The Cho'Gath size scaling examples are about tying into his kit's gameplay, right? Like the fact that his E and his R are better as you get more and more size. Like that just kind of makes sense for Cho'Gath, right? Like where it's, hey, this champion is getting bigger. His spells, feel like they, to some extent, feel like they match that. And we have, by the way, discussed, should Cho'Gath W and Q also scale with size? And I think the conclusion at the time, like last few times we've talked about it, was, well, we don't know where we would pull power. Like it would obviously be on fantasy and it could be really cool, but it would also be really, really, really powerful for those spells to scale with size. And there would have to be trade-offs and sacrifices for that. And we're not sure that those are worth it. And so we didn't do it at those times. But maybe at some point in the future, we might consider that. Like as an example, if I snap my fingers, we woke up tomorrow and Cho'Gath was 42% win rate, we'd probably be like, yeah, we should probably give him, like, there's a lot of power and cool on fantasy power we could give him by letting his Q and W scale with size in some way. Anyway, that kind of getting side tangented here. But to get to the sort of core point here, this was done, again, like I said, I have not verified this, but my understanding is that this Tahm Kench Q was done size scaling to make visuals match gameplay correctly, which previously it did not before the mid-scope changes, and was not about hooking into our gameplay systems in a very clear and direct way in the way that it does today, because we added so much size scaling to the game after this was done. For what it's worth, I do think there's also a question of what would it look like? Like, is the game better or worse if there are more spells that scale with size in the game? And also, is the size scaling amount on Tahm Kench correct, right? Like, I do think that for what it's worth, there's probably a little bit too much size scaling in the game. And also, I think that the way that Tahm Kench Q scales with size is probably too powerful, right? Or probably not the correct amount of power. Like, like I think it's scaling with size is totally fine and reasonable, but the amount of extra distance and like the amount of extra range and general power that Tahm Kench Q gets with size, I think is probably not correct. Like, it's probably a little bit too much power per size, and also I think there's a little bit too much size, especially in Mayhem, right? Like, I think Tank Engine and Goliath just give too much size. I also think that for what it's worth, that I probably gave too much size on Heartsteel, so my bad. Anyway, those points aside, ultimately this just a lot of it comes down to like whether the time and resources it would take to like say go through every tank and try and evaluate like, or not even every tank, but just like every champion, hey, which of these spells should scale with size, and like, do we need to redo their VFX in order to make this work? Like, how does the game, like, what does the gameplay look like when it scales with size? Like, is this important? Is this critical to their pattern? Does this break any of the, you know, core tenets of the character? Is this on fantasy, etc.? Right? There's a lot of questions to answer. There would be a lot of work to do. It's not to say that we could never do it or that there aren't places where it would be valuable. I think that probably there are cases where it might be nice, right? As an example, some of the spells that like I think feel particularly off to me are like something like a Malphite E or something like a Ornn W. Feel like, yeah, maybe they could or should scale with size. It's just there's a lot of work that goes associated into that is required to make that work. And then the question becomes like, is that work not better spent working on other things? Like, because this stuff is, it's not no value, but I don't think it's super high value either to even like consider these kinds of size scaling things. And so my perspective on that is mostly that it's probably usually not worth it unless we're already working on the champion to even consider size scaling type stuff like this. And it's probably only really worth heavily considering for fighters and tanks because those are the champions that mostly like get into size scaling stuff. And that I think we're likely to index into size scaling in any meaningful way. Either way, I will say that I do think there's interesting things to think about here, but I wouldn't expect stuff to change significantly just because it's a lot of work, like visual effects wise, for us to make something scale with size. And it's a lot of work gameplay side wise to like introduce a new type of scaling, especially like radius or like length or like distance scaling on spells. Those are some of the hardest things to validate gameplay wise, and so it is a lot of work to make a spell scale its size or its radius or its AoE or you know, diameter, width, whatever, right? Like whatever the right metric is for a spell, with an exotic stat like size. And so it ultimately just comes down to like that work is probably like the time that we could spend working on things like that's probably generally spent elsewhere. Should Terminus have ability power added? So I think this is an interesting question. It kind of gets at some of the things that have shifted over the years. When Terminus was originally made, it was with the intent that it would be living in a system where there wasn't really a super built out, super dedicated AP on hit system. Like that was pretty much a property, like AP on hit was pretty much a property of Nashers alone. And that Rageblade wouldn't even really factor into those builds particularly much. Over the years, we've shifted this, right? We've added more support. Like we've added more support for AP ratio, the AP on Rageblade. We've added items like Dusk and Dawn and the current Shiv. And we've shifted to like, there is more of a bridge between the AP and the AD on hit systems. They share more items, and there is more support for AP in like on both sides, but especially on the AP side, of course. And so from that perspective, I kind of look at this and I say like, yeah, in keeping with the modern on hit system, maybe this is the right thing to do. I will say my personal take on this is that I don't think Terminus is a particularly satisfying or compelling item, and adding AP to it, it does disenfranchise some of the core users, right? Champions like Callista and Vayne that do like Terminus right now, that don't really care about or have to care about the percent MPen, don't want AP on this item, right? Like obviously, you know, we've given both of them AP ratios, but they still don't actually want to buy AP. And so there is some cost to putting any amount of gold value into AP on this item. There is upside too, right? Like it's, you know, a way more interesting item for Kale, for example. And you know, there's definitely some advantages to going down this road, but it's mostly a question of, is it an upside or downside? The more like, do we want to merge the AD and AP on-hit systems more or less? Like, do we want them to share their capstone items more or less, right? And do we think it's really important that champions who are building mainline AP on the on-hit side and don't care about AD very much, do we think it's important that they have access to percent penetration? Because there's other ways we could accomplish that, right? As an example, I'm not saying this would be good, but as an example, we could say Bloodletter's Curse now also works on-hits, right? And so dealing magic damage with an on-hit shreds MR, right? I don't know if that's good or bad. I haven't really thought about it that much, but like we could accomplish that goal of like, oh, you're playing, pure AP attacker Varus, right? You're not actually playing caster AP Varus. You're playing attacker AP Varus, and you want percent penetration. Okay, well, guess what? You can buy a Bloodletter's Curse in that world, and you can actually, stack that in some ways. Anyway, don't need to get into all of that. My answer to this is maybe, right? I don't have a solid like yes or no answer to this. I think a lot of it depends on the perspective of like what direction do we want to take the on-hit system. My personal take is, generally speaking, that I think that Terminus is just not that satisfying and not that interesting of an item. And I think that it's like it probably would be better. I suspect long term, it's probably better if the shared items in the on-hit space are things that aren't super stat reliant, right? Are things that, like, as an example, imagine we had an on-hit capstone that's just 70% attack speed. Cool, right? Like, both the AD and AP on-hit systems will be happy with this if they're buying like a fourth item, 70% AS item that like uncaps your attack speed or something like that, right? Like, obviously there are other things we'd have to fix if we wanted to do that. But my suspicion is that having these shared capstone items has, I think, not like, Rageblade having a bunch of AP on it, for example, I think has not actually been super positive for the way that champions like Callista and Vayne interact with the on-hit system. Like there's a decent number of champions in that space, right? Even like Master Yi as an example as well, right? And so my inclination is to say it's probably better for everyone in the system if we differentiate a bit more and we create the right items to capstone builds on both sides of the AD versus AP on-hit system, and create the items that feel good and are appropriately matched for the champion kits that want to buy them, right? And I think Terminus, and I think Rageblade to some extent too, one of the problems with these items as I see them right now is I think they're trying to do too many things. And that's part of why like Terminus is kind of unsatisfying. It's just doing so many things distributed over a lot of outputs, right? Of course, it's hard to be satisfied by like 24 armor and MR that's distributed over 6 auto attacks effectively against champions, right? It's like really hard to tell what that's doing for you, right? Similarly, like 30% penetration split over 6 auto attacks effectively. It's pretty hard to tell what's going on there, right? And so, of course, distributing Terminus's outputs more doesn't sound at a face level super compelling to me, even if I think it is a bit more in line with the way that we've shaped some of the on-hit system more recently with things like Shiv as an example, right? Like things like Shiv and Dusk and Dawn and even Rageblade, some of the changes we've made to Rageblade have supported a more heavy, like an AP attack, like a more AP attacker builds. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the capstones for the AP and AD on-hit / attacker builds should all be exactly the same and should all be rewarding on both sides. I think it's probably long-term correct if we have separate capstones and maybe one capstone in common, but not every later part of the build is probably supposed to be in common on both sides, because it's very hard for us to serve these two audiences in ways that are really satisfying at the same time with the same stat profile and this exact same effects, is the way that I look at it. For Aatrox, is there room for minimum Q damage consistency to help heavy builds versus durable targets? And this is talking about light versus heavy Aatrox. Heavy builds have fallen out of favor. Something I'll note is I took a quick look at his current live builds when I was answering this question. And this is one of the examples of like, it can be kind of funny sometimes or kind of weird sometimes when people ask questions about something that's a little topical or like in relation to like something that's really current, and then I answer the question like 2 months later and things have changed. Because I looked at his builds right now, and his builds are pretty middle of the road, right? The most common first two items, like the first two item pairing on Aatrox right now is Shojin into Sundered Sky, which is a pretty like middle of the road fighter build, right? That's like a medium fighter. Like I would consider that to be pretty firmly a medium fighter build. There's definitely real pick rate on items like Cyclo Sword and Serilda's as well, which are definitely lighter, or like more, more assassiny / like skirmisher / lighter fighter items, or like for Aatrox, they're lighter fighter items. But the current builds actually, I would say, are pretty middle of the road. Not necessarily like super heavy, but like around how heavy Aatrox's builds normally are at their heaviest, right? Like that's about, I would say, Shojin into Sundered Skies, like about as heavy as it gets. Maybe Shojin into Cleaver or something, or the reverse of that might be a little heavier, but that's about as heavy as his builds have ever been. Anyway, more specifically on this question, minimum Q damage is not a real thing. I don't remember what the person was actually like mechanically asking for, but minimum damage is not a real thing where like we're not going to say because you have 600 armor, actually only the first 300 armor matters, and this must deal at least 76 damage or whatever. We have a mechanic that says this does this amount of damage. It's called true damage, right? And in fairness, like I don't think it's unreasonable to say, hey, when we want you to be good against more durable targets, we give you a mechanic to make you more good against durable targets, right? It's like, but minimum damage is not a real mechanic here that we would use, because I think there's a bunch of weirdness around that. And we have other better mechanics to solve this problem. We have things like max health damage. We have things like true damage. We have things like percent penetration or even shreds, right? And I think that there is a real question here around, hey, does Aatrox have the right incentives and the right kit structure to target the things and have the builds that we want him to have, right? Target the things that we want him to target and have the builds that we want him to have, right? Or like have the builds that are super on fantasy and actually like live out the drain tank fantasy, right? Are all these things correct? Something I've considered before is, what if Aatrox Q applied a stacking armor shred debuff such that hitting them with your first two Qs was really exciting, because if you then hit them with your third Q, with your Q3, it'll do a lot of damage, partially because they're percent shredded or something like that, right? It's like, this is a case where I think that if we really want the champion to be target agnostic, there's a lot of different ways we can do it, right? I think, to me, the ones that come to mind for Aatrox specifically, if we said we wanted him to build more durable and target frontline more, we could give him something like a percent shred on Q and pull a little damage out of the Q or something like that. Like a stacking shred, especially, where it's like, oh, maybe as an example, let's suppose we make a stacking shred that goes up to 4, and it's 8% per stack or something like that, and hitting them with the regular part of the blade is 1 stack and the sweet spot is 2. And so the fantasy, like the dream, is that you hit Q1 sweet spot, Q2 sweet spot, they're at maximum stacks, and then your Q3, if you sweet spot them, does a ton of damage because they're fully shredded or whatever, right? It's like, if we wanted you to try and use all of your Qs on a frontliner, then that would be, I think, a reasonable mechanical way of getting that to happen. Alternately, we could say it has there's a small amount of max health damage on sweet spots or something like that, right? Like there's lots of different methods we could get. However, I will say one of the things that can be dangerous about this is when we give a champion with a lot of target access, a lot of target agnosticism, and Aatrox is not, he's not the most mobile champion in the game, right? But he has a large movement speed steroid and he has a low cooldown dash, right? And so when we give him a lot of, if we were to give him a lot of target agnosticism, one of the risks that we would be incurring is that he then just uses all of his mobility for dodging spells or getting to his targets, and he doesn't actually have to worry about taking any risks in going for backline or anything, right? It's like, I think there is a careful balance we have to maintain here, where we do actually want Aatrox to be rewarded for using his movement speed and his dash to go forwards and actually try and threaten backline. And there's some tension there that we do want to preserve, because the version of Aatrox that we make really, really, really good at hitting frontline, I think is very dangerous, because when you look at Aatrox in comparison to like an actual juggernaut, as an example, like a Darius, right? Where, well, of course, Darius has to be good at hitting frontline. He has no tools at all to get to the backline. And you look at Aatrox and you say, well, he has a lot of tools. He has a lot more tools than Darius. His tools are way worse than, say, like Yone or Riven, right? but they're a lot better than the actual like heavy champion, like really heavy fighters. And so I think a lot of this is just about maintaining a careful balance. And one of the things that kind of comes in conflict here is that healing off a percentage of your damage, like having powerful innate healing off your damage, is skewed against frontline targets, right? Even though it literally heals you for less because you do less damage to them, uh, they won't kill you very quickly, right? Which means you just get to get more value out of healing off a percentage of your damage, and they're not going to burst you comparatively to like a mage or an AD carry who might like just kill you really quickly and prevent you from getting a lot of value from your healing. And so Aatrox does have a mechanic that is more effective against frontline, right? Like is more effective against durable targets, which is his dream tanking, his vamp. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's tuned the correct amount, or that Aatrox is all tuned correctly. Right? It's like ultimately my answer to this is like minimum Q damage is not the right framing or not the right mechanic, number one. Number two, I don't personally have a super strong opinion on is Aatrox in the exact current game the exact right profile in terms of target selection and like incentives to hit different targets. I'm not actually sure, right? I'm not a huge Aatrox player personally, and I don't have a super great read on that on live right now, like on the current patch, like exactly what is the deal. But if we wanted him to be more incentivized to hit the front line and to build a little more durable, I think we have plenty of ways to do that. But I don't have a super strong opinion on like whether it would be a good idea to shift him in that way literally right now. So apologies if this is like kind of an unsatisfying answer because it's like, is there room? We would have to take power from somewhere. And so the question is always like, is that worth it, right? Like, is the change worth doing? Because power-wise, no, he does not have room for free power. And so the answer, like the answer ultimately becomes like, what do you want to give up in exchange for this, right? And I look at his kit, and one of the, I think, difficulties with Aatrox is that he has very few places where the power is not floored in terms of satisfaction, and it's very difficult for us to shift power around on his kit in meaningful ways because he is. I think he runs into one of the problems that we have with like one spell damage champions, which is that they end up not having a lot of numbers that we can tune very easily to like shift power around in their kit. Usually it's ideal if your champion has like 2 or 3 spells that deal damage, and have like tunable minor effects and like cooldowns. But Aatrox's cooldowns are tuned pretty tightly around his Q, like especially his E cooldown is tuned pretty tightly around his Q, and his damage is tuned basically exclusively around his passive and his Q, right? And so we don't have a lot of numbers to work with on the champion. There are some, right? Don't get me wrong, right? I'm not saying we can't tune anything. He has base stats just like any other champion and so on. But he is a difficult champion to move power around on relative to a lot of others. And so something like this, I think the question is, number one, does he have the current build incentives and targeting incentives that he should have? Don't have a good answer to that. I just literally don't know. And number two, where would we want to pull power? Because for my current look, I look at his kit and I don't see something that I'm like, well, we should just pull power out of this thing because no Aatrox player will care and it's not important to his functionality. It's like, I don't see an obvious number like that, right? I don't see something that's obviously not important to his kit structure and also something that Aatrox players won't care about. And that's like ultimately my answer here is there room? Maybe if we cut from somewhere. So probably not a super satisfying answer, and I apologize for that, but that's the answer I have. Could GP's power budget be shifted slightly towards Bruiser while keeping his crit build optimal? And this person specifically wanted a fighter build with more passive gameplay. So I think the short answer to this question is it probably could be, right? I think that there probably are levers we could use here. I think of things like, specifically related to the passive, hey, Gangplank does, as a fighter, actually get in there and brawl a bit, right? Like he sometimes attacks people, right? Is there a way that we could say like, hey, attacking, like on hit against champions refunds 1 second off your passive cooldown or something like that, and we raise the base cooldown by 1 or 2 seconds or something, who knows, right? Or the passive cooldown scales down over game time or something like that, right? It's like there's lots of different things I think we could do here, where we could incentivize fighter builds and probably not impact crit builds too much. I will say one risk here is that Gangplank is a pretty sensitive champion tuning-wise, kind of similar to the Aatrox stuff I was just talking about. Gangplank's a champion that has needed a lot of work to get into, I think, a reasonably healthy state, where there would definitely be some risks with almost any change to like trying to enable fighter builds. Like, oh, are we enabling? Are we just giving a crit build more like, sustained output, which could be dangerous because part of what makes the crit build reasonable is that once the barrels are gone, the crit build doesn't do a lot, right? Like once you've used all your barrels, the crit build's kind of like, well, I guess I can sort of cue people from low range and that does do a lot of damage, but I'm really squishy and I'm very vulnerable when doing this. And maybe I like flash auto attack someone and does a lot of damage, but there's a lot of risk associated with doing things like that, right? Whereas fighter takes a lot less risk to get in there and passive people and all of that. Anyway, I guess to get to the point of what I'm getting at is we probably could do this if we thought we really wanted to support fighter builds more, which I think it would be a very reasonable goal for what it's worth, right? It's like I think it's pretty clear at this point that most Gangplank players prefer playing the crit builds, like the squishy, more mage-like crit builds. But I think it's also pretty clear there is a specific subtype of Gangplank player that does like the fighter build more, and I think it would be very reasonable for us to try to support them. I think it's just a matter of figuring out, like, number one, when would we want to spend time on this if we did, decide that we wanted to go down this road? And number two, how do we make sure that we're not putting crit Gangplank at risk or putting Gangplank as a whole at risk tuning state wise by doing these changes, because he is a pretty sensitive champion, right? He has a lot of things that can go wrong pretty easily based on even small changes to parts of his kit, right? Like, to be honest, I'm kind of surprised that we haven't needed to change him more in the last couple of years as we've like changed systems and items around him. And it's been nice that we haven't had to do too much tuning work on him over the some of the more recent systemic changes. But ultimately, I think the answer to this one is pretty simple. It's like we probably could do something like this, and I think it would probably be nice for us to support the fighter Gangplank builds a little bit more. I do personally actually think that supporting like Trinity Force type, Trinity Force Sterax Gangplank being a more functional build, assuming that we could maintain the power of the crit build being very similar to what it is today, and the functionality of the crit build being very similar to what it is today, having a build where you can build stuff like Trinity Force and Sterax, I think would overall be positive to me. Percent pen and shred versus epic monsters. And this person was talking specifically about how Bloodletters and Cleaver don't work on epics, but percent penetration does. So this is an awkwardness, right? And I'm going to acknowledge that this is something that I don't love in the current system. The reason why shred doesn't work on epic monsters is that we don't let you make the epic monsters weaker in any way, right? We don't let you stun them. We don't let you slow them. We don't let you make them deal less damage. We don't let you reduce their resistances, make them take more damage, right? We don't let you do any of those things. And part of that is like core gameplay reasons. Like we want the epic monsters to be epic monsters and we want them to take a certain amount of time to kill. Like there's both from a sort of cleanliness of gameplay as well as from a functionality of gameplay standpoint of, yeah, in a world where like, imagine a world where we say you can now shred epic monsters. Are you just going to assemble a team with like 3 or 4 armor shreds, buy a cleaver on a couple of them, and then now you're going to go fight Baron? He's going to have like 6 armor against you or something like that, and you're just going to shred him down instantly with a strong AD carry? Is that like that seems like a negative gameplay outcome to me? In general, this has been true forever, like this rule, but it hasn't really been relevant except until the current season because we resistance skewed the epic monsters in this season. And I think this is something that probably just slipped a little through the cracks of like, we didn't really super deeply consider how these things interact when we did this, right? As an example, something that's awkward about this in the current game is that, well, percent penetration is now really effective against epic monsters and it was not before. And that means that like on-hit champions that buy Terminus as their percent penetration source are actually a lot worse against epic monsters because Terminus only stacks against champions, right? And so Terminus is now a worse epic slaying item comparatively to LDR. And is it correct, as an example, that like relative to previous seasons, on-hit champions are now worse against epic monsters than, or like on-hit carries, I guess I should say, are worse against epic monsters than crit carries, right? Is that a good shift? I don't know, right? My inclination is to say no. I think that's probably not correct. And maybe the complaint here is actually like Terminus doesn't work against epic monsters, but it doesn't really bother me that buying the sort of like more generic team utility item is worse against epic monsters, right? Like this is the Bloodletter's Curse and the Black Cleavers. To me, if you're brand and you're making a decision point between Void Staff and Bloodletters, and your conclusion is I should go Void Staff so that I can do more damage to the Baron, and that's like the greedier, more selfish option, that I think is compelling to me, right? Like that's like an interesting point of decision making. However, I think the case where it's particularly awkward is around Terminus and the fact that Terminus only stacks on champions. But hey, I'm playing a cleaver champion, and that means that I'm giving up like a cleaver instead of going for a Cyrilda's on, say, I don't know, Talon or something like that. And that means that you do less epic monster damage. Seems like a pretty reasonable trade-off that we can present to players, even if they're not thinking about it. Like if this is not a point that you're making decisions around. If in terms of actual output, buying the selfish, greedy damage item generally means you're better at dealing damage to epics, that seems fine. And not coincidentally, the items, Bloodletters and Cleaver that have Shred on them also offer you defenses. They offer you both. In both cases, they offer health. You are tankier, and you get less damage, and that meaning that you have less, like you have more survivability, and you're more likely to live, but you're less likely to actually like be able to like have the DPS to do an epic monster. That seems appropriate to me, like shape-wise. I think it's fine. Now, the degree to which that's true might not be correct, right? Like, I don't know if the exact degree to which we resistance skewed the epic monsters in the current season is exactly correct. Maybe we actually gave them, 20% too many resistances, and it's too sharp right now. That could be true. I haven't really examined that deeply. But overall, the thing that this mostly brings up to me is like something that is a little bit awkward, that I don't like, is that Terminus specifically doesn't work on epics, which means that on-hit attacker builds are relatively worse against epics in the current season comparatively to crit attackers than they have been in previous seasons. So I don't like that. But aside from that, I think this shape is okay. And I think it is pretty important that you are not allowed to like make epic monsters worse by debuffing them. But I could still see us making some changes here, and I could see there being some questions around is the exact amount of resistance skewing that epic monsters have today the correct amount, right? Like maybe we want to give them 10% more HP and 10% less resistances, or vice versa, or 10% more or less effective HP from resistances, not literally 10%. You get what I'm talking about. Mathing it out, right, to the right numbers. But basically what I'm getting at here is there is something here maybe that maybe isn't right, but I don't think it's specifically that buying items that shred your opponents is worse against epics than pen. Because I think it's correct that buying the selfish greedy option makes you better at dealing damage to pretty much everything, including epic monsters, is the way that I would put it. I think that's fine. Why does Ignite inflict grievous wounds? So I think there's two separate interesting questions here. One is, why was this originally added to Ignite? What was the reasoning behind that? Which I don't know the answer, but I can do some wild speculation, which we'll get to shortly. And number two is like, why is this still there, right? Because like a lot of things in the game that are super, super, super old that were made in like season 1 is like, or earlier, a lot of the question is not necessarily like, why was this originally done, but like, why is it still that way? Because we've had lots of opportunities to change it. And, the question is always, is it better to change it? Is there something else that's better? Is there something, some other better place for this or whatever? As for why it was originally added, to be honest, not a clue. I would guess the original reasoning was probably, hey, we want some light context on summoner spells, right? The idea, if you look at the shape of the original summoner spells, right, things like, the same summoner spells we have today, right? The Cleanse, Ghost, Flash, Smite, right? Ignite, Exhaust, Heal, even, right? I think a lot of the idea of the original summoner spells is that you would want to change these to some degree from game to game, but you wouldn't always want to change them, right? And so Ignite being the like PvP damage summoner, having some light context on it's a bit better against people who heal a lot, or oh, this is a way that you can get access to grievous wounds to prevent someone from healing a lot in the early laning phase in a specific moment. Right, all of those things make sense to me, and those are all things that I could imagine someone thinking when they made summoner spells in 2009 or whenever this was made. I have no idea. Whenever whoever made the summoner spells originally made these summoners, I could absolutely imagine them thinking, "Oh yeah, this would be a good strategic choice to have systemic outlet for really powerful healing in the laning phase. In the early game, because in the early versions of the game, you could get grievous wounds in other ways, and some champions had grievous wounds, and so there was some strategic pick like depth to your pick around that, right? Think of champions like Katarina having grievous wounds in the olden days. But anyway, I'm getting a little sidetracked. What I'm getting at is basically, I suspect that in the original design structure here, Sorry, I had to sneeze there. But I suspect that in the original intended design structure, the grievous wounds was probably not something that was thought about super deeply, but was a little bit of extra light context to the damage summoner spell, like the PvP damage summoner spell. And there really probably wasn't a whole lot more to it. In the modern day, as to why we've kept it, I think we do really value that little bit of extra context around, hey, sometimes, you're playing top lane and you normally take teleport on, I don't know, insert your favorite top laner, Jax or whatever. But this game, you're playing against Mundo or Vlad, someone who heals a lot. And you're thinking, it would really help me kill this person if I had Ignite. Maybe this is a game where I should actually consider taking a different summoner. And maybe you don't take Ignite, you take Teleport, and you think, damn, if only I'd taken Ignite, I could have gotten this kill. If I could have reduced their healing and done a little bit of extra damage, that would have made the difference. And that causes you to think in an interesting way about the way that you choose your summoner spells, right? I think also one of the things that it offers is, hey, this means that the entire burden of grievous wounds in the modern day is not exclusively on the item system. It's not this entirely binary, did this person buy Executioner / Oblivion Orb? And it also is, are you affected by an Ignite at this time, right? There are still ways, even if you don't involve the item system, that someone can be grievous wounds, which means that we don't have to tune healing exclusively around, there is this 800 gold spike that people can get that, applies grievous wounds. There are other methods of access to grievous wounds, which means that we don't have to purely worry about do we need to tune early game healing very sharply down and let it scale in really explosive ways because of the 800 gold that spike that will allow people to reduce healing, and then therefore we need early game healing to be really low because people can't have that access yet. We don't have to worry about that because you can potentially be ignited in early bot lane 2v2. We don't have to make Soraka Q heal 10 HP when she hits someone at level 1, because you can literally be ignited, right? That is an option that the opposing bot lane has. And so we don't have to worry about do we have to crater all or super early game lane healing because of that? No, there is a literal way you can access it early on. And that allows us to tune healing a little bit differently because of that. Ultimately, I think that, to me, Ignite having grievous wounds is a positive. I think of this as I'm not that worried about the tuning stuff. I personally really, really, really like the extra sort of little bit of context that Ignite has around, do you care about the anti-healing this game? Right? Are you against Darius? And do you think that might win you a close 1v1, being able to ignite his Q heal or something like that, right? Are you against a Mundo or a Vlad or, I don't know, a Gwen or an Aurelia or someone who just heals incidentally? And that extra little bit of context, I think, is almost the perfect amount of extra, sort of thought context around summoner spells. Because to me, I think that summoner spells shouldn't be a really complicated decision to make. I think there should be a little bit of context on the decision, and that's about it, right? I think that it's really, really, really good when the summoner spells are something that you don't think about very much, but when you do think about it, you can make a different decision in some situations that you find yourself in and feel good about that decision, or feel bad about it if you made the wrong decision in some cases, right? And I think the Grievous Wounds on Ignite specifically really gives you something that's super compelling to think about and to look at, because of the way that it interacts with certain champions, certain healing. And it can even be good later on in the game, right? One of the things I think that's also cool about Ignite is that sometimes you take Ignite just because I'm Pantheon, I don't care about I'm Pantheon top, I'm going to take Ignite because I just want to kill them. And sometimes that light extra context on the Ignite just feels good later on. I ignited the enemy, I don't know, Soraka later in the game, or like Bloodthirster Draven later in the game, and I felt good about that interaction, even though I didn't take Ignite for the Grievous Wounds. Ultimately, I think a lot of this just comes down to Grievous Wounds is powerful in narrow situations, but it's not like an overwhelming checkmate, right? It's not, oh, you have Ignite, literally, like, I'm Bloodthirster Draven, I can never fight anyone with Ignite, right? That's not what anyone's saying. It's just like, yes, this does literally make your Bloodthirster a little bit less powerful, but, you know, or make your Soraka W a little less powerful, or whatever, or Q, whatever, you know, whatever the case might be. But I just think that little bit of extra context on why this thing is good or bad adds a lot of depth to people who want to think about taking their summoners, or want to, you know, pay attention to their summoners later on in the game and feel good about them. And I think that's about the right amount of depth, right? Like, we could make this like summoner spells a much deeper system, right? We could make 3 different versions of Ignite that all have really great, you know, powerful situational components to them. But I think it's probably too much, and that's probably, people would be thinking in that version of the system, probably thinking about the summoner spell system too much, and we don't want it to occupy a lot of mind share. It's supposed to be a high variance, like low frequency system that has these spiky moments of variance that feel good on both sides in a lot of cases. And having a little bit of context on top of that, I am generally really, 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 really positive on. All of this having been said, I don't think that Grievous Wounds is like particularly critical, right? Like, as an example, I think the vision on Ignite is also good. It's just, it's even more contextual, and it's less in your control whether it's going to matter or not. And so if we could find something else, I'm not saying specifically that Ignite needs Grievous Wounds to have all of these properties that I'm talking about, right? Like, as an example, it could also have a burst of like missing health damage at the end or something, and now it's a little bit better against tanks. And it's like, okay, maybe that's good. Maybe that's a cool contextual thing. Maybe it's bad. I don't know. Or it could have a, I don't know, what's another good example of like something contextual that maybe would fit in a similar space. Like, it could, I don't know, give you like, no, on hit damage is bad. On hit damage is too kit bound. I don't know. I can't think of another, like, here's the thing is, like, I'm not thinking of another, like, about the right amount of context mechanic that is also really simple and straightforward, because we also don't want the summoner spells to be super complicated. And so that's also a problem we run into here is we want the summoner spells to be really simple, approachable, and understandable. Like, when you get an Ignite cast on you, you know exactly what's happening, what exactly what's about to happen to you. And so I like Grievous Wounds, I think, just fits really well here. Is my ultimate answer of, it's about the right of about the right level of complexity, it's about the right level of context, and I think it just feels good and structurally makes a lot of sense on both ends of, gives you a little bit of context, and also can make you feel good about like having access to that summoner later on in the game situationally for cutting healing, even if you didn't opt into like literally buying a Grievous Wounds item. So I am generally a fan of Ignite on, or Grievous Wounds on Ignite, or Ignite on Grievous Wounds, I guess. Alrighty, last question for today. Why was Dirk removed from Eclipse build path? Is there, and basically this person was asking, is there space for max health damage in the assassin system? So to me, these are actually completely separate questions. I understand that, you know, Eclipse has max health damage on it, but the reasons for Eclipse being changed have very little to do with the assassin system in and of itself. They actually have a lot more to do with the caster system. Let me explain. So the intent with Eclipse was that it would be the sort of default first item for our AD casters. This is like our, especially melee AD casters, right? This is champions like Ambessa, champions like Riven, champions like Aatrox. And the idea, right, obviously this Eclipse change was done before Ambessa existed, but she was in development at the time, I think. I think she was one of the considerations, or maybe that was too early. I don't remember. It doesn't really matter. Anyway, the intent was, hey, these AD casters, you know, the Hekarims and the Rivens of the world, they should probably have some dedicated item support, right? And I've given them more of this, right? I give, you know, Endless Hunger was also intended to be for them. And I think factually, since the melee buffs, has actually been working decently for them as well, which has been nice. But this is something where we wanted to support them. And historically, one of the problems with Eclipse is shaped a little bit for them, though I will say I think Eclipse is a little bit too generic in terms of its input, which is representative of the fact that it is a mythic, and mythics were intentionally made to be as generic as possible. But in general, the way that I look at this is, regardless of whether Eclipse is functioning or not on live, which I would say that it's not really doing what it's supposed to be doing, the reason why Dirk was removed was that if Eclipse was functioning, the reason why we didn't want that item like that, like the AD casters to have lethality on their, their primary first item, or their like one of their main items that they would be buying in the early game, is that lethality is a stat that we don't actually want them to have in their main build paths. This is not to say that we can never let like a Hecarim or a Riven or an Embessa or whatever buy a lethality item. That's fine. We just don't want that to be their default build, because lethality leads them down a very different path where they become much more assassin-like. And the goal with these champions is that they're not assassins, that they are light fighters that do their fighter thing by casting a lot of abilities. And the reason why we tend to give these champions defenses that scale with their AD, like say Riven and Hecarim as great examples of that, is because we want them to build a lot of AD and have their abilities be impactful. And giving them giving more AD and no lethality on Eclipse is a way that we can say, look, your abilities will still deal a lot of damage and you can still get defenses, right? And we don't have to like leverage them into a lethality build path that still somehow makes sense, even though, lethality is going to lead them down the road of your only purpose is to one-shot squishies, which is not the goal for these champions, right? That's not the structure, right? Because if your goal is only to one-shot a squishy, you are an assassin, right? You are not an AD caster, right? You are not a, light fighter, right? And so the main thing here with Eclipse was that Eclipse was intended to be a caster item. It always was, to be clear, right? It was always intended to be like bridging the gap between AD casters and assassins, and then the actual reality ended up just being that meant that our AD casters, when they were buying Eclipse, often just turned into assassins. But that was a problem with a lot of things in the Mythic system, where like different classes kind of got souped together because of how generic the first items were. We don't need to get into all of that. Anyway, the Eclipse thing is, if your complaint is that Eclipse isn't working, I 100% agree. I don't think that Eclipse is currently working. I think that currently its passive is so generic that it's so unopinionated, and of course the intended users are just going to go elsewhere a lot of the time for their items, because the other items have like greater synergy with their kits. They have not only feel better for their kits, but also like factually do hook into kits better. Whereas Eclipse has to be generic, like has to be balanced around being such a generic item that it can't really be particularly good on anyone because of how broad it is. And so I like, my opinion here is like, I think that Eclipse should probably be sharpened to be much more clearly functional for these AD casters, and less like try less to serve like also the assassin audience and also the like general fighter audience, etc. Right? Anyway, we don't need to get into that. The second question here I think is also interesting, of like, is there space for percent HP damage in the assassin system? This is another funny example of these questions are months old that I'm getting to, and literally on live with Voltaic Cyclosword, the current version, there is another percent damage in the assassin system item. And so the answer is yes, I think there is room for this. And in fact, I think there's some designers that actually believe that moving the assassin class more, like to shift them to be a little more fighter-like and let them have a little less dependence upon only killing squishies would be a positive. Personally, I'm actually more on the line of, I think that we should make more items like the modern Umbral Glaive, where we give assassins items that have outputs that do factually help them kill people, but also outputs that help them, do something besides just, that helps progress the game state besides just killing people. In Umbral's case, that's, dewarding and like, clearing vision and being able to set up vision for your team and all of that. And of course, Bastion Breaker was intended to be this. Bastion Breaker, I would say, is not really working in the same way that Umbral Glaive is clearly working on live. But to me, that's, a sort of better solution to giving like a better way of getting assassins to have a output that is not like have a powerful output that is not exclusively just like assassinating squishies on repeat, because that causes a number of problems in the game if your entire class's only output is just constantly killing a squishy over and over and over and over again. And so there are lots of different potential like solutions we can move towards. I think having a little bit of target agnosticism in the assassin system is not unreasonable, and to some extent, it's like both Bastion Breaker and Umbral Glaive, items that I did for this season, have lethality scaling true damage, which does help assassins deal with armor in a small way, of course. But the answer to the second question here of like, is there space for it, is clearly yes. We have Cyclosword. I think that's totally fine. Like percent current damage, percent max health damage, maybe could be done, right? Like there's some true damage. I think they're having some, they're being some light context on like, hey, this is a more target agnostic assassin item is totally fine. And in general, I'm not opposed to that. I will say that I do think we should go down like the main method we should pursue to sort of solve out or like pursue long term, like what is the AD assassins class supposed to look like in terms of game shape is, to me personally, I really like the idea of more items like Umbroglaive giving you secondary outputs that are useful for helping you end the game and helping your team in some way, shape, or form, or selfish outputs that help you end the game, like Bastion Breaker. I guess also sort of helps your team, sort of, but it's mostly a selfish thing of like, I'm gonna knock down this turret and get a bunch of gold and get a bunch of plates, etc. Right? Anyway, yeah, hopefully that explains both sides. I guess the summary I'll give for the first one is Dirk was removed from Eclipse because we want AD casters to get a lot of AD. We don't want to give them lethality because that makes them more assassin-like, and we want them to actually have distinct, light fighter gameplay. And we also want to scale their defenses with AD, and that's harder when we have to take away AD on their items to give them lethality if we're giving them lethality on their items. And so it's better for their defenses and like for the shape of their kits if we scale their defenses with AD, and so that makes more sense. Again, structurally that didn't really work that well, right? Like I don't think Eclipse is doing the thing it's supposed to do on live, but that was the intent. And then in the second question is like, yes, it's like there's space for percent HP damage in the assassin system and a little bit of maybe a little more generic damage, right? Cyclosword definitely has that. But also at the same time, I am a little bit wary of pushing assassins to be super target agnostic because then they're literally just fighters, right? They're just fighters with better target access, right? Like like one of the main concern points I have here, right? The extreme outlier example is if Talon can kill Darius in a side lane, for example. Like if Talon is good at killing Darius in a side lane, what is Darius's purpose, right? Because Darius is less mobile than Talon, and can't act like and has way less access to like map mobility and like the ability to like force his own will onto the game. And so if we make assassins super generic, like and able to like fight fighters and like have better access to things like max health damage and the ability to kill non-squishies effectively, the danger is that they're just better fighters when we do that. And so I think we have to be pretty careful about how much we allow assassins to be target agnostic because they do have more tools than fighters do for getting to people. And so we would be, we run the risk, the more target agnostic we make assassins, the more we run the risk of just making them into just fighters, but better. Not saying we're anywhere close to that point. It's just a risk that we have for sure. The more that we add that kind of like generic scaling item of like you can fight anyone to the AD assassin system, and so there is some risk there. Anyway, that's gonna be the last question for today. And yeah, thanks for watching, and guess maybe see you in number 24.